Collins set up his fair in Leicester every year from the turn of the century to the 1950s. Some of us might recall our first sight of moving film at one of Pat's kinematoscope booths. By the time we reached the 50s, the cinema had long replaced the kinematoscope, and it would not be long before TV tempted us to stay in at night rather than go out to the cinema. Mind you, when we did go out, we didn't worry about losing our way in the Newark Street underpass. There wasn't one. Traffic wasn't much on our minds in any case, though the Leicestershire Regiment's cadet marching band threw up a few hazards of its own. Here, the band are marching down Newark Street past the Magazine pub. The regimental barracks were not far from what is now De Montfort University. In 1964, the Tigers became part of the Royal Anglian Regiment. The barracks themselves fell victim to the 60s traffic plan that was designed to transform our city into a commuter's utopia. Before the war, if we had the money, we could always have a go at flying at Braunstone Airport. Cheap package holidays were still a few years away. So were airport delays. In July 1950, Charles Anson Smith, headmaster of Rushey Mead School, decided it was high time his boys broadened their minds through travel. If they survived the Channel crossing, they were headed for Salamanca in Spain. They weren't taking any chances on local transport. They'd brought their own. They'd forked out all of 80 quid on an old corporation double-decker, and they called it the Spirit of Leicester.
They knew that if they painted it white, they could then put adverts on the various panels. And the very first panel he sold was the front one, which was the most expensive. That's for Metallastic. That first advertisement covered the cost of the whole bus, you know. When I first asked my father if I could go to Spain, he looked aghast at it, and, you know, he was not, I didn't actually tell him we were going to Spain for a start, you know. I said, can I go on a school trip, you know, and so I almost got him to say yes until he said, well, where are you going then? And I said, to Spain. He was amazed, you know. I knew that something special was happening when we arrived to get on the bus, because the crowds were enormous, you know. You couldn't move on the pavement or the road. And we were talking hundreds and hundreds of people, you know, not only the parents of the lads who were going, but also anyone who had been associated with the school or the Spirit of Leicester in any way seemed to turn them up to wish us well. I could look back down Marfield Street, which as we left for the Checketts Road traffic lights, and there was just a host of people, you know, crowding on the roads and around the school buildings there. You've got to remember, this was only 5 years after the war, so there were a lot of strong feelings going on about the continent. Nobody in my circle, anyway, ever went beyond Mablethorpe and Skegness and perhaps Blackpool. Tours, Spain might as well have been on the other side of the planet, it was that far away. The most spectacular place that I saw on the whole of the 3-week holiday was in fact Salamanca, which was the end of our journey into Spain. It's a fantastic picture it has in the mind, because I've never seen anywhere like it before or since in all my travels. The Pyrenees, of course, they're spectacular. I mean, there were no bypasses. There was only one road up there, and you had to take the hairpin bends. We even had to get out the bus sometimes, you know, because it was such a struggle to get up the hill and round the bend that often we would walk up the hill to take the load off the bus, you know. The last few miles it was beginning to cause trouble again, but only when you went up a steep hill, and it got us all the way back. By now, all the papers had picked it up. We were the celebrities of the city, you know, and if there were hundreds to see us off, I'd say there were thousands to see us back. You couldn't move for people. So the reputation of Rushey Mead and the spirit of Leicester had moved far and wide.
A year after the spirit of Leicester had come safely home, Lady Jane Grey paid a return visit to Bradgate Park. One thing we never seem able to resist in Leicester is a good pageant, and thousands of us would turn out to enjoy the fun. We'd had a few royal visits since the war. In October 1946, we welcomed King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. Part of their visit was to what was then one of our leading industries, imperial typewriters. In October 1950, Princess Mary, the Princess Royal, also came to Leicester. In 1958, Her Majesty the Queen and Prince Philip toured our city. Whatever the weather, many of us turned out to celebrate. Of course, we couldn't have expected the real Queen to join our coronation celebrations of 5 years before that, but that didn't stop us from putting on a show for ourselves. As we stood in the rain, packed together along Humberston Gate, or straining for a view up on Granby Street, and as we cheered for the coronation of a new Queen and the start of a new age, what did we really expect of the future? And what, we wondered, would the future expect from us? Few of us could even have guessed at the change the next 20 years would bring. Change in almost every area of our lives, whether we wanted it or not. There were some changes we did want to see in Leicester. Like most big cities, 70% of our homes had been built in the last century. Damp and infestation threatened the health of generations. Even by 1951, a third of all our homes still had no bath or indoor toilet.
We had basically nothing at all. They did put electric lights in, but we had no running water, nothing. The toilet at the end of the yard we shared with the next door neighbours, and you know, basically we had absolutely nothing.
Our particular home was in a yard of about 4 houses who shared toilets and washroom, and a washroom at the bottom of the garden and everything, you know, 2 up and 2 down, and a tap in the yard to be shared. You were on top of one another down there. To your next door neighbour, you could shake hands through the hole in the wall going to bed at night time as you're going up the stairs.
You used to have the coal fires where the front of you was burning off while your back was cool. The soot in the early 50s, the smog used to be so thick that you could actually, you know, touch it. It was so thick. I know several times I've left work and I've actually passed my gate. I couldn't find exactly where my house is because the fog is so thick.
The house we moved in was actually on Bakewell Street in the Highfields area. It was above a shop. It was like a flat, and it was in a poor state of decoration. It had an attic with the roof sloping onto it, and that was supposed to be a bedroom, and it was absolutely damp. And of course, because there was a shop downstairs, you used to get all the various smells of the various foods that were being sold. There was that, and the houses had a lot of problem with mice or rats.
Of course, there was always much more to areas like Wolf Street and Highfields than bricks and mortar.
There was a whole community of small houses with grandma round the corner and auntie in the next street and mother and father and the children in these little working class houses built in the 1850s. There was a tremendous community spirit of small shops. Everybody knew everybody else in the whole district. There was the church there thriving still, the old St Matthew's Church.
It was a very happy area. There were things in the Wall Street area that you don't even find today. There was a comradeship amongst neighbours that was there. There was a note from people if you needed. People were there to help out, and they didn't need to be asked or whatever. If they saw a need, they were there.
In the 50s when I came here, you could leave your door open and go downtown and come back and find your house safe. Nobody ever think of actually stealing anything. I mean, the milkman used to leave his milk on the doorstep. The bread man used to leave his unwrapped bread on the doorstep.
Well, you can't move people from terraced housing where their front doors come next to each other. You can't move them into the high-rise flats of the 60s, Rowlett's Hill. You can't change, I mean, you can't sort of move people to that sort of thing, can you? And things not change.
But in the 1950s, this was a time when change was exactly what many of us did want. And our new city planning department was thinking big. The clock tower was going to be surrounded by luxury flats and rooftop gardens. A monorail and 3 types of bus would keep our streets free of traffic. Coming up at long last was the commuters' utopia we'd been promised, to say nothing of a mini Manhattan in Highfields. The architect of these changes was to be Mr. Conrad Smigielski. 100 Leicester women, dubbed by the Mercury Smigielski Smashers, were to survey our traffic needs. The aim was to prepare for the expected boom in population and traffic use. Some of these ideas would prove to be too expensive or impractical, but much of the plan went through.
Wunsthorne Way and Burley's Way were put through. I didn't realise it so much at the time, I don't think. I was sad because I could see what was happening to the old part of Leicester. I mean, now I can see it even more. The old street of Leicester, High Cross Street, it cut it in half, and it was its death knell, really.
I think my interest would be on the accessibility of the new roads in the city centre. I wouldn't be, like some folks would be concerned about losing a lot of things that were of a great memory to them or whatever. In my case, it would be, I would be thinking more in terms of I can get across the city centre now from sort of Braunstone to Humberston much easier than I used to in the old days when I had to go down all the side streets and dodge everything that was around there.
I've known the buses go along the Humberston Road, the Belgrave Road, going out of town in the evening, with people almost hanging out of the doors. They just packed the buses full at the rush hour.
On new parts where we lived, I can remember there were virtually no vehicles that ordinary people owned until the later 50s. Then there was a number of people who had motorbikes and sidecars. That seemed to be the cheapest form of transport for a family.
I think as the pace of life moved on, it seemed to drag you along with it. So after a while, yes, a car became essential to me because I wanted to take out my family to the seaside and so forth.
The busiest time in the city centre was on a Sunday afternoon for vehicles. It was a time when the Salvation Army used to go meet in the marketplace, walk round the clock tower and back to their premises in Wall Street. And it was also a time when everybody who was fortunate enough to have a car showed off the car by driving around the clock tower to let everybody see them sitting up there in the old banger.
More than our city streets were destined to change.
I don't think I can ever forgive Mr. Beeching for axing the railways like he did. When I think of all those hours of work that were put in with the railways, we've lost most of those little stations now, haven't we? That's one thing that they did then, and we shall never get them back.
The Great Central Railway Bridge over Thurcaston Road came down in the 70s. For long periods during the 50s, 60s and early 70s, parts of our city where many of us had lived, brought up our families and worked began to resemble bomb sites. Some of the demolition was inevitable. Many buildings had simply outlived their use. Leicester was growing. Alongside the development of our inner city, more of us were choosing to move out and live in the county and commute to work. Unfortunately for the new band of rural commuters, not even the countryside would remain immune to change. Even here, new technology and new ideas were weaving their wonders. That didn't stop a lot of us questioning just how wonderful this new technology really was. If we managed not to break down in our cars, or have them impounded, for many of us city dwellers, a new hazard was looming. Traffic wardens came to Leicester in 1961. Lucky old us. We were the first city outside London to get them. Not that on-street parking was that hard to find during the 60s. Traffic wardens might never become popular with some people, certainly not with Leicester's criminal classes. Over the next 2 years, because traffic wardens had freed them for other duties, Leicester's constabulary would double the number of arrests they made at or near the scene of crime. Like the police, all the services would need to modernise. We didn't get a national health service until after the war. Before this, some of us would rather bite the bullet than fork out for the dentist, and we get our glasses from Woolworths. Now, no matter what our income, we could use services from midwives and childcare to vaccinations and home nursing. Combined with improved healthcare, better housing outside the city centre would benefit children especially.
It was much like going to live in the country, because we'd lived in town centre all our lives. You know, if there was any grass growing, it was between the cracks in the pavement, and I mean, they would quickly be eaten by somebody if they were there. But nearly all the estates were on the perimeter of the town, and we're at that time, although they're not quite now, we're at that time, you're sort of the border area to the country. To have a garden, you know, where little tots could run around and that sort of thing. The old man could go out and dig a little bit and grow a bit of green grocery, and the kids could have the rest of it to play about with, and the old lady, she could have the front to put a few flowers in to let people know she got a nice front garden and that type of thing. Something that hadn't been before, you know, and then this was a wonderful thing for them.
School days.
It was the beginning of the 1950s that there was a change from rather formal education. I mean, the nurseries had toys and the first classes. There was the beginning of this free activity. So the first hour of the morning, the children were supposed to have lots of free activities, and they would have lots of ideas, and there was dressing up and things. And after that, it was fairly formal. There was less traffic. There was no scare about children being abducted and this, so children had a lot more freedom. Children still played in the streets. And there were no crowds and crowds and crowds of mothers with cars lining up outside all the schools, collecting their children. Children went home on their own.
In those days, it was a very simple system, but a very strict one. All misdemeanors were punished with a cane, or, you know, and in how many strokes you got depended upon how bad the crime was. Most of us managed to get away with only a couple of strokes in the 2 or 3 strokes in the 4 years we were there, but it made you very much aware that, you know, there were rules and you were expected to obey them.
We were still expected to wear gloves, hat, and you weren't seen out in the street without them. If you were in trouble, you know, even then.
In the Wall Street area, the schools were the usual council-type school. The old-fashioned rod and rule idea of the old schools was existing in those days. And you would the atmosphere would be that you would work up until a leaving date at 14 years of age. When they moved us from down there and up into the area, the schooling in the area was a much higher grade, and they went into a much higher educational area, up to the age of 16 eventually. And the possibilities of working themselves up to the point where, with enough qualifications, they could go to college. These things couldn't have happened in the old days, couldn't have happened in the Wall Street area. They didn't exist.
We all love a good wedding, but in the years just after the war, family life came under new pressures. In 1947, there were a record 60,000 divorces in Britain.
When the men returned from the war, I think there was a hope of full employment again and everything returning to normal, but it didn't for everyone.
There was a family born while the war was going on, and now all of a sudden I was coming back into the family, and the youngsters at that point in time, we had 2 youngsters, 2 boys. They had to get used to having me around, and I had to get myself used to being around them and the wife and taking over a new role, well, not a new role, but a fresh start of an old role of family life, looking after finding enough income to keep the family going and living accommodations and such things as that.
While we were waiting to swing into the 60s, what did we think our families expected from us?
That I would behave myself, that I would get married and have children in that order. Still, then, you know, there was no living together. It just wasn't acceptable. And quite honestly, I don't think I'd have gone against my parents, and you know, and it's as simple as that, really.
It was always in my mind, because Irene and I had been courting since Irene was 14 and I was 15, that we would get married, and at 18 we became engaged and set about trying to save to be married, because I don't really know where we had the idea from, but we were always going to buy our own house, as opposed to parents who lived in council houses. And that's what we did. We tried to set aside £3 a week saving, and by the time we were 21 we'd certainly got enough to put a deposit on a house and buy our own place.
I think if you weren't married by the time you're 21, you were more or less on the shelf. I can't remember many girls really wanting to be career women at that time. I can't think of any friend of mine who particularly wanted to stay single and do her own thing.
I went to work and we enjoyed ourselves, I suppose, and that was it, really. No careers, at least I didn't feel like that, you know. No ambitions, no, you know, just we enjoyed it.
Married women began to be able to pursue their professions after the war. It started during the war. Before that, professional women were generally out as they married and had children. Now, there was always a big area of women working in Leicester. That's why Leicester had nursery schools. The earliest nursery classes were formed because so many of the women went out to work in the factories.
There was a great strain on couples trying to bring up a family, because it was necessary for both people to be at work, i.e. to actually maintain a certain standard of life in this country. But not only in this country, because one got to remember that a lot of us who came here, we had dependent relatives at home that we actually had to send money to actually help them. I think we all aspired to have our own home, and to do that, you had to work and save every penny that you could.
By the 1950s, Leicester had become one of the leading industrial cities in Europe. The 60s would see a real boom in output and jobs. It was said you could walk out of a job in the morning and into a new one in the afternoon. That might have been true, but the new job might not tempt you to stay long either. The old idea that we would stay in the same job for life was over. Production line technology had boosted output and lowered the price of consumer goods, but it had also made many of the jobs we did boring and repetitive. Many jobs had disappeared altogether, as had some of the smaller workshops and factories that perhaps our families had known for generations. On the plus side, between the start of the 50s and the end of the 60s, our average weekly wage more than doubled. We'd never had it so good. We could take work for granted, and it was work that would draw people to Leicester.
Leicester used to attract a lot of immigrants, both from overseas and also from the country as a whole, because when I came here, it was said that if you couldn't find a job in Leicester, you couldn't find a job anywhere else, because there was a huge mixture of industry in Leicester, the shoe, hosiery, and a lot of light industry. And in times of unemployment, people from other parts of the country used to come to Leicester to find work. So what has actually happened, that sometimes you have to inquire very deeply to find somebody who's actually born in Leicester. They're always from somewhere else.
Northampton and Leicester in the Midlands were the most prominent production areas for boots and shoes and hosiery and that type of thing. And we had a lot of people come to Leicester to work in the boots and work in the hosiery factories. And I think that sort of acclimatised everybody to the fact that, you know, you didn't have to come from Leicester to work in Leicester.
But just how welcoming a place was Leicester?
If you went to the job centre, as it was called then, to get a job, no one asked you what skills you had to offer. You're directed to two places in Leicester for work. One was John Bull, which is now Dunlop, and another place on Melton Road, which is called AEI. Those are the two places at that time that employ black people. And when you went to the job centre, those are the first two places that could actually send you, because many firms, you went there, you see vacancies, and when you got there, you're told quite politely that we're sorry we don't employ, black people.
It wasn't only Leicester that was changing after the war, the whole world was. People were on the move. Over the years, communities of Irish, Polish, Ukrainian and Chinese people have become established in the city. Now people from the Caribbean would make their home here. In the late 60s, events were taking place thousands of miles away that would affect Leicester in ways that few of us could have imagined. By 1971, Leicester would have the highest population of East African nations anywhere in Britain.
Suddenly from the time when I was a boy, when I had a coloured doctor, and he was the only coloured man that I'd seen in my lifetime, to being able to walk out in the scene and almost every third person you saw was a coloured person, that was a great change, and everybody had this change.
In actual fact, when I came to Leicester, I think I knew all the black people at that time lived in Leicester, which probably numbered less than 50.
Coming here and you see a totally different life altogether. I think it's a shock when you come here and see people who are poor as well, because you never expected in England to have poor areas. England for me was one of those rich countries where I thought, well, the Queen's there and the houses and everything, I expected things to be better.
Leicester, well, it was almost a shock in the beginning because of the housing situation for a start. I mean, when we came to the Highfields area, that's the only area where we could rent a house. These estate agents were reluctant to show you a house which was in a better area. So they directed you virtually to Highfields or Belgrave.
We thought it was really nice because every evening we used to see loads of people in the street, used to see loads of girls dressed up in the street, and we were quite happy. We said, well, we don't feel lonely because there are quite a lot of people in the street. And it wasn't a few years later when I learned about the English way of life and what happens in England that I realized that we were living in a red light area.
Actually, it was quite difficult to meet people from your own community, because within the Asian communities, of course, you have the Hindu community, the Muslim and the Sikh. So if you wanted to meet people of your own religion, it used to be quite difficult. The meeting point was either a mosque or a temple, which is usually a small house, which had been converted for that purpose. Or you came to the Abington Cinema to see an Indian film, and that's where people often met.
I saw the attitude changing. Because I had been here in the 60s and you went into a shop and people didn't make comments and they welcomed you quite openly. And then, you know, the same shopkeepers then started turning their noses up towards, you know, the Asians walking into the shops. Their attitude started changing. They're saying, oh, they're going to... Because I think media played a big role. Idi Amin coming on television saying they're going to take your country over and things like that, comments like that. you know, just didn't help.
I do remember quite clearly the time when Enoch Powell made his first speech in Birmingham. I think Rivers of Blood is what he called it. And there was quite a bit of stir in the whole of England about what he had said. And obviously that had led to a lot of incidences, and the good work in race relations that was going on was considerably damaged. But Enoch Powell's speech did not get too far, fortunately. There were a lot of other people who spoke against him, and over the years, fortunately, the good seem to have prevailed, and for sure, Rivers of Blood haven't come about.
Fright was the thing, I think. I think the locals were frightened of what might happen with this new influx of outside faces suddenly appearing on the scene. They'd gone through a period of time when, and coming through to a little bit more prosperity, and now there was suddenly a threat to it, and that was the thing that bothered folks. But I think once that they accepted it, and once it had settled down and they saw that it wasn't the great threat that they thought it was, that minds changed around a great deal.
The Co-op opened a new grocery store in Leicester Forest East just before the war. We get to become familiar with the word supermarket, but this was a step towards it. By the time we reached the 60s, we'd seen the adverts on the new commercial television station, we had more money in our pockets, and we wanted a bigger choice of things to buy. The way we did our shopping was about to change. Lee Circle opened in 1962. This was the first multi-storey car park in the country. You could park here for 2 hours for £1 or 3 6pence for as long as you liked. Charnwood Street, once known as Leicester's Petticoat Lane, was cleared for new housing in the late 60s. Shortly after this, we lost Simpkin James in the marketplace. Its fall was no doubt due to the rise of supermarkets like Woolco in Oadby and Sainsbury's, which had opened up in Cank Street. The crackdown on parking nearby probably didn't help much either, though some of the store's customers weren't too bothered by this. They had their groceries delivered. Simpkin James still exists today as a wine shop, not too far from its old site. In its heyday, it not only sold wine, it employed its own bottle washer, who toiled away in the cellars deep beneath the store. For as long as we could remember, Simpkin James stood as our byword for exotic culinary delights, at a price.
It was quite an expensive store by my standards, but you know, everyone remembers the bacon in there, and everyone remembers their magnificent range of cheese at Christmas time, and of course wine. So it really was a beautiful shop.
Myself and one of the older sisters, on a Friday night, we sent out, and we would have to take 2 basins with us and about 2 shillings in old money. And we used to go around to Johnson & Johnson and Simpkin James. And we'd had to, the routine was that we'd have to go to the bacon slicer stall and buy the scrap bacon with 2pence or 3pence for what they'd got wrapped up to come away. The basins were cracked eggs, and we'd have to go to a store, one of the counters in the place that sold eggs, and they would have all the cracked eggs underneath, and we would buy cracked eggs in the basin, you know. Cheese store for the cheese bits and whatnot, and these would have to go back to the home at night time and sorted to be used during the week.
They used to sell beautiful coffee. When you passed, you could smell the fragrance of the coffee, and any kind of a food that you actually wanted, that's one of the shops you could actually go and actually get it. That was nearly all men used to serve in there. They used to wear striped pants and long white aprons, you know, and it really stood out. I used to go there because some of the things, ethnic things, that's the only shop you could actually you know, get it, because they seem to used to import, you know, things from all over the world, like dried beans and dried peas and all those sort of things. They used to have them there.
We lost Simpkin James in 1971. What else had gone?
There was Marshall and Snellgrove, or Adderley's.
Pratt's pet store. It was like a miniature zoo, I always thought.
Joseph Johnson's, now Phoenix.
Amateur's Paradise was all electronic gear, radar sets, you name it, you know.
You hadn't been to the city centre if you hadn't visited Lucy's.
But you see, we've lost Morgan and Squires, we've lost Grice's, we've lost Lee's, Morley's, and we've lost the little specialist shops. There was one in particular just inside the marketplace called Dent's. It specialised in ladies' items like gloves and collars and cuffs, a thing of the past. But they're the things that I began to notice were going. We were losing a lot of the niceties of life, I'm afraid, in this process, and a lot of the old shops were going as well.
While the Americans and Russians were still dreaming of space travel, Leicestershire museums were busy building a rocket out on New Walk. This was the 50s, but we weren't just thinking of the future, we were also examining our past. In changing our city to meet the needs of the future, we were uncovering some of our history. In laying bare Roman ruins around the underpass near Jury Wall, perhaps we were reminded that through the centuries, Leicester has always had to change and adapt. We lost a lot of our railways, and we never got our monorail. We did get motorways, though they wouldn't stay as empty as this for long. By the early 70s, Leicester had become a very different city from the one we'd known just 20 years before. Many of us had lost much that was valuable to us, but there were also things we'd gained, and few of us would seriously wish to put the clock back completely.
When we moved into the 60s, then yes, there was this sort of swinging time. We were beginning to forget about the war, and things were beginning to happen that we could enjoy. And it changed us all a little, I think.
After the war, where this cry of land fit for heroes, and people, certainly ordinary people, had aspirations to improve the lot, and having achieved that to a degree in the 50s and 60s, I think people then tended to forget how we'd achieved it. People had to actually fight for the rights and for decent living wages, and so some of the gains have been thrown away in a sense.
But it was a nice period in my life, the 50s and 60s. It was one, you know, where people were more considerate towards each other, possibly a spin-off from the war years.
I think glancing back at my own life in the 60s, I thought people were much more friendlier towards each other. People had time for each other. You could go and knock on someone's door and people were always willing to help.
People were much more relaxed because they didn't have the pressure of everyday life around them, that you must have your house carpeted, or you must have a fridge, or you must have deep freeze or something.
By the 60s, young people had more money in their pockets and were demanding a voice of their own.
I can remember reading in the Leicester Mercury that Rock Around the Clock had been shown, I think, at the ABC cinema, and there'd been teddy boys rocking in the aisles, and that certainly impressed me.
One Sunday night at the Coliseum, I just got out of the seat and danced in the aisles. Nobody cared. It was as though it took over your soul, that kind of music did.
I think probably we were going through a sort of revolution, if you like. Didn't think about it in those terms at the time, but I think probably the main difference was there was a whole generation of youngsters that were crying out for change.